There's a version of every partnership that ends the way the press release says it did. Clean, mutual, no hard feelings. And then there's the version that actually happened. Somewhere between those two versions sits a single sentence spoken years later, almost in passing, by the man who got left behind. Not angry, not bitter, just honest in a way press releases never are. He'd been frustrated for 2 years. 5 words said long after anyone was still paying attention. But once you hear them, you can't unhear them because they don't match the story everyone was told at the time. So what really happened in that room? 8 years, 2 major championships, 14 wins together. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, Phil Mickelson boarded a flight to Las Vegas to end it all in person because some conversations he believed were too important for a phone call. That's the part almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. Not the split itself, the choice to fly there, to sit across from the man who helped rebuild his swing and say it to his face. So here's what I want you to sit with for a second. How does a partnership that is productive, that successful, just stop? What actually has to break for a player to walk away from the coach who got him back to the top of the game? Before we get into what really happened in that room, I want to know what you think. Was this Mickelson doing the right thing the hard way? Or was there more going on beneath the amicable split headlines than either man ever said out loud? Drop your take in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we're about to break down exactly what happened. To understand why the ending mattered, you have to understand what came before it. 2007. Mickelson's driving accuracy had become a real problem. Good enough to win, not good enough to close majors the way he wanted to. So he made a call most players wouldn't have the guts to make. He walked away from Rick Smith, the coach who'd guided him for 6 years, and picked up the phone to Butch Harmon, the same Butch Harmon who'd spent a decade building Tiger Woods into the most dominant golfer alive. Think about that for a second. Mickelson didn't just hire a coach. He hired his biggest rival's coach. That's not a swing change. That's a statement. It worked almost immediately. By 2010, Harmon had helped rebuild Mickelson's swing into something more controlled, more repeatable. And that April, Mickelson slipped on his 3rd green jacket at Augusta. 3 years later, in 2013, he added an Open Championship at Muirfield to the collection. 2 majors under one coach in 6 years. Here's something small that people barely noticed at the time. Every morning before a round, Harmon and Mickelson ran through the same short pre-shot routine together. Nothing dramatic, just a habit, a rhythm the two of them had built without either of them really talking about it. Nobody thought that mattered. It was just what winning partnerships do. They develop rhythms nobody has to explain. By every measure that counts, this was one of the most productive coach-player relationships in modern golf. 2 majors, 14 wins, a player rebuilt at exactly the moment he needed it, which is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to explain. But golf doesn't let anyone stay on top forever. Not even the players who've already proven everything they need to prove. After that 2013 Open win, something shifted. The wins stopped coming, not dramatically. No single disaster, no bad headline. Just a slow, quiet fade. Mickelson's world ranking started sliding. Tournament after tournament. He was competitive without ever quite being dangerous again. Here's the thing about a slump like that. This is what it looks like when a player has nothing left to prove. No ranking to chase, no reputation to save. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. There's no external pressure forcing a change. No sponsor threatening to walk. No must-win moment. Just a quiet, personal question a player has to ask himself when nobody else is asking it for him. Is this still working? For most players, that question goes unanswered for years. Comfort wins. The routine stays the routine because changing something that used to work feels riskier than living with something that slowly stopped working. 2 years passed like this. 2013 into 2014, 2014 into 2015. The longest winless stretch of Mickelson's career at that point in his life. Still top 25 in the world. Still, by any normal standard, a great player. But great isn't why Mickelson hired Harmon in the first place. He hired him to be great again. Past tense, already creeping into a career that wasn't supposed to have a past tense yet. And then Mickelson did something no one expected from him. Late 2015. Mickelson didn't send a text. He didn't make a call. He booked a flight to Las Vegas. Sit with that choice for a second because it tells you more than almost anything else in this story. A phone call takes 5 minutes and costs nothing. A flight takes half a day, costs money, and forces you to sit across a table from someone while you say the hardest sentence you'll ever say to them. People don't choose the harder option by accident. They choose it because the easier option feels wrong for what they're about to do. So Mickelson flew. He sat down with Harmon over breakfast, and he told him in person that it was over. I need to hear new ideas from a different perspective. That's the line that made it into every headline. Polished, respectful. The kind of sentence a publicist could sign off on without a single edit. And on its own, it tells you almost nothing about what that breakfast actually felt like, because here's what the headline version leaves out. Harmon didn't fight it. He didn't push back, didn't ask for another year, didn't remind Mickelson of the 2 majors they'd built together. By every account, he listened and he agreed. 2 men who'd shared some of the hardest years of their personal lives, Harmon's wife's illness, conversations that had nothing to do with golf at all, sat there and ended 8 years without either of them raising their voice, which raises the real question underneath this whole moment. When a conversation goes that smoothly, that respectfully, that quickly, is that what a genuinely mutual decision looks like? Or is it what it looks like when one person has already decided and the other person is simply too dignified to make it harder than it needs to be? Nobody in that room was going to answer that for the cameras, and maybe neither man could answer it honestly, even for himself. Remember that small routine from the golden years, the pre-shot habit Harmon and Mickelson ran through together every morning, the one that seemed like nothing at the time? Look at it again now. That routine didn't survive on its own. It existed because 2 people trusted each other enough to build something small and repeatable without either of them questioning it. A habit like that isn't really about the swing. It's about comfort, and comfort is the first thing to go quiet when someone's already decided to leave, which means the cracks probably didn't start in that Vegas breakfast. They started earlier, somewhere in those 2 winless years, in ways too small for either man to name out loud at the time. The pace of the practice session, a comment that landed differently than it used to, the routine getting shorter instead of longer. Here's the number that undercuts the amicable version of this story. Mickelson didn't spend months searching for Harmon's replacement. He didn't take a season to figure out his next move. Within weeks, not months, weeks of that breakfast, Andrew Gitson was already working with him. Weeks! That's not the timeline of a player reeling from an unexpected split. That's the timeline of a player who already knew exactly where he was going before he ever said goodbye to where he'd been. So which version is true? The one where 2 friends respectfully agreed it was time to part ways, or the one where a decision had already been made long before either man sat down at that table, and the breakfast was simply the moment it became official? Maybe it's not one version or the other. Maybe it's both, depending on which man you ask. Here's the thing. You've watched this play out before, even if you didn't clock it as the same story. A coach and a player build something together. It works, then it stops working. The player moves on, and almost every single time, the language that follows is identical, amicable, mutual, grateful for our time together. It's the vocabulary of professional sports breakups, used so consistently across every era, every sport, that it barely registers as language anymore. It's just what gets said. But think about how rarely that vocabulary tells you who actually made the call. Amicable can mean 2 people agreeing at the exact same moment. It can also mean one person decided and the other person was gracious enough not to make it public. Golf, more than almost any sport, runs on that kind of managed narrative. There's no messy public trade demand, no televised trash talk, just 2 men, a joint statement, and a story tidy enough that nobody has to ask the harder question underneath it. So here's what's actually worth sitting with. If every coach-player split in this sport gets described with the same handful of respectful words, regardless of what really happened in the room, How would we ever tell the difference between a genuine mutual decision and a one-sided one dressed up to look like it? And if we can't tell the difference from the outside, how many other amicable splits in golf's history were actually something else, entirely, quietly filed away under a word that simply sounded better? That's not a question this story alone can answer, but it's the question this story forces you to ask about every other one just like it. Remember that sentence from the very beginning. 5 words said long after anyone was still paying attention. He'd been frustrated for 2 years. That wasn't Mickelson. It was Harmon. Years later, in an interview almost nobody watched, finally saying out loud what the amicable split headline never let him say at the time. Not bitter, not accusing, just quietly correcting the record, long after the record stopped mattering to anyone but him. 2 years. That's not a throwaway detail. Harmon confirmed in his own words exactly what those quiet cracks in Section 4 actually were. Not a sudden breakfast decision, but a slow unraveling he'd felt happening in real time, long before Mickelson ever booked that flight. Which brings everything back around to what we already know about the timeline. A player doesn't line up his next coach within weeks unless the door had already been closing for a lot longer than one conversation. So here's what this story actually is once you strip away the press release language. It's not really about a breakfast in Las Vegas. It's about how long it takes for two people to admit, even to themselves, that something has already ended, and how much longer it takes for the rest of the world to hear about it, dressed up in 5 polite, forgettable words. Harmon knew for 2 years the headlines took a lot longer to catch up. So where does that leave you? Was this the healthiest split in modern golf? 2 men handling a hard ending with more grace than most professional relationships ever get? Or was it the most polite way one of them ever said goodbye to something that was already over? I'm not going to answer that for you. I don't think either man fully answered it for himself. What I do want to know is what you think and who's actually watching this. Drop your verdict in the comments. And while you're there, tell me where you're watching from. City, country, how old you were when Mickelson won that 13 Open. I'm genuinely curious who this story reaches. And if this is the kind of breakdown you want every time golf can't agree on something, subscribe. The next one's already coming.